what would you suggest to international relations students? How much and how deep theory knowledge do they need?
Well, as I try to lay out in my presentation, I think at a professional school in particular, you need to be exposed to a broad set of theories in order to understand the fundamental drivers of international relations. The core of my argument would be that in order to guide policy, you need to understand these fundamental drivers. There is no direct link between theory and practice in the sense of, if you know walls, for instance, you know how to run the world. Mm-hmm. No doubt that is not the case. But understanding how walls, for instance, think differently about the world than went, exposes you to very different sets of thinking about world politics, and knowing those different sets of thoughts about international politics is crucial for policy.
You mentioned that you believe students need practically useful theory. How would you define that?
Well, I was trying to use a quote by Kenneth Waltz, which is not widely known because Waltz, at least in my reading, is often misunderstood to be a proponent of explanatory theory, which I think he is not. His definition of usefulness actually emphasizes the fact that scholars in a certain discipline find it useful to talk about, to discuss, to argue about a certain theory. This is the quote that I showed in my presentation. And I think that is indeed also an understanding which I would myself take to be as quite important. In my view, a meaningful distinction between different types of theories actually relates to what I call constitutive theory, causal theory, and normative theory. And the usefulness of all these three kinds of different versions of theory is, I think, almost immediately intuitive if you are faced with different situations in foreign policy making where, in order to come to grips with a concept, say, of the balance of power, a possible rise of China, a potentially new bipolar constellation, is of immediate relevance for the practice of foreign policy. And in that sense, it is practically useful. The same applies to causal theories, when you might be able to manipulate certain variables, as, for instance, in the so-called democratic peace theory, where the causal link is between democracy on the one hand and the establishment of peace as an effect on the other. If you know that this theory is true, you might certainly want to establish democracy, because that in itself then would help to propel peace. And similar things apply to normative theories in terms of their usefulness. If we study, for instance, just war theory, that gives us guidance as to under what criteria and conditions we might actually start a war or decline to start a war.
You also mentioned that great leaders are not necessarily great theorists, but those who are trying to frame the discussion about the current leaders' actions need to have some sort of understanding of these theories. So what would you suggest to the students? What sort of theory could they apply, for example, for understanding the current events in the European Union?
Well, that is an extremely good example for the limits of the application of theory in a certain fashion. I think it's fairly well established among IR theorists that the European Union, that international relations within the European Union are of a different sort than international relations, say, in a typical anarchical world. The European Union is not organized in terms of classical foreign policy, because as a supranational body, the European Commission has a lot of say in what we would call classical domestic politics. That already, the fact that the classical definition of anarchy in a realist sense does not apply to the European Union, because obviously this is not a Hobbesian world anymore. Hopefully it remains that way, because the issue of peace and war seems to be re-emerging during the Euro crisis, at least at the margin. But in the classical understanding, this is not a classical Hobbesian world. the concept of a security community has been applied to the European Union in a fundamental sense, and I think it applies in the sense of peace being durable and assured among these states. And that has the consequence that applying traditional theories of international relations to the European Union are certainly applicable only in a limited fashion. I think the practical advice which I would give to students in trying to relate theoretical knowledge on the one hand and dealing with a crisis such as the Euro financial crisis currently in the European Union is that you should draw on a very diverse set of knowledge in the discipline. We have, and I think it does still apply even in the European context, we have classical realist theories which emphasize not only balance of power aspects but also things like pride, national pride. And I believe that that is a fundamental driver which guides foreign policy of some governments in the current crisis. On the other hand, just to mention two examples, in the classical tradition of liberalism, we have many theoretical offers in terms of the effects of interdependence among states. And that is obviously the case. I mean, if you look at the consequences of the Euro crisis, decisions taken in Germany for Greece or developments in Italy and how they how it produces repercussions for the German situation. There is a huge interconnection here which does not make sense if you look at it in classical international relations terms. So in that sense, the simple advice would be draw on your wealth of theoretical knowledge and be creative in using this knowledge in trying to understand why the European Union has come to where it is and how it might actually get out of it.
Thank you very much once again.
Thank you.